What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we're here. We're at the conclusion of Dan Slott's Spider-Man run. Yes, this run that we've been covering for years here on Comics Explained, kind of off and on, infrequently. But the whole run will basically be done. So we'll probably combine this whole thing into a full story, and I don't even want to know how long that video is going to be, man. It's probably going to be longer than like 8 hours, right? I mean, it's just going to be a colossal video. But having said that, what this does is it initially picks up with Norman Osborn basically in this old room, right? This old kind of home for himself, right? The old Osborn residence, and just talking to somebody that we can't really see, right? Now, following that, what you actually end up doing is picking up 4 hours beforehand in the apartment of Mary Jane Watson, where Peter Parker and Mary Jane are making out. Now, this is something Dan Slott's kind of been a dick about over the course of his run. One of the big things that Spider-Man fans hated, we've talked about this before, and it's like the one thing Spider-Man fans can just never get past, is the dissolution of Mary Jane Watson and Spider-Man, their whole relationship, their whole marriage and everything, coming in the aftermath or as part of Spider-Man One More Day. And something that we're going to do once we get closer to the release of the movie, we're going to remaster One More Day, and then we're going to cover Brand New Day, and then One Moment in Time, right? We're going to kind of do that trilogy of a story, one of the most reviled trilogies in the history of the Spider-Man mythos, and we're going to cover it. But one of the things that Dan Slott had constantly done was tease this idea that maybe Spider-Man and Mary Jane Watson would get back together, but they never really did. And in fact, this is the closest that we ever really got, where they were kind of in a relationship, but ultimately it gets shut down. And the reason why is because from Mary Jane Watson's perspective, kind of recalling her history and the whole idea with Peter Parker and Spider-Man and all that kind of stuff, that it's one of these things where she says, like, at the end of the day, the world needs Spider-Man more than I need you, right? Or more than you need me. And I can't have both. I can't have you all to myself because you have to be Spider-Man. You're going to put your life in danger. There are times when I'm going to be worried about you. There are times when I'm going to be in danger because of the fact that villains are going to find out that you and I are together. And so because of all those things, ultimately she just kind of ends up shooting the idea down. And I wouldn't go as far as to say Peter Parker's, a fan of it, but I will go as far as to say that Peter Parker's kind of like, I guess he understands it, right? And so sort of goes forward and does his own thing. And so following that, what you actually end up getting here is, again, kind of switching back to Norman Osborn, this whole thing where as he's talking and as he's kind of going on, the whole drive of Norman Osborn has been to figure out who Spider-Man is. Now, one thing I want to point out, and something that we covered in our video on Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin Explained, is that Norman Osborn did at one point know that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. Ultimately, Marvel undid that because, in truth, they just kind of found it to be more reasonable to believe that Norman Osborn didn't know that Spider-Man was Peter Parker. And indeed, it actually made for more compelling stories, because with something like that, once an identity of a superhero is known to a villain, and the whole shtick of that superhero is that no one's supposed to know who his identity is, the most logical course of action is for that villain to attack that superhero's personal family. And you can only tell that story so many times before people get tired of it. And so instead of making that a main caveat to the Spider-Man mythos, Marvel just nixed it and was just like, nope, we're not playing that game at all, right? So ultimately it just kind of went away. And so at the moment, Norman Osborn does not know that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, but he's trying to figure it out. And he's been tracing off all these routes, right? Like Horizon Labs and Max Modell, where Peter Parker served as part of that think tank for a while, that you had Liz Allen, who was at one point the wife of Harry Osborn, and basically the mother of Normie Osborn, that she basically merged what was Horizon Labs, her own company, and Oscorp into what we now call Alchemax, right? She's a supremely important and intelligent person, but trying to like trace all these routes and trying to figure out what in the world is going on here. Now, of course, there is a point in time when Phil Urich, the son of Ben Urich, the really more interesting reporter, not a super interesting plot point here, but basically the guy who's the current iteration of the Hobgoblin, really the Hobgoblin King, ultimately is defeated by Norman Osborn, right? It was kind of a cool little thing, like, I guess, whatever. Norman Osborn versus the Goblin King. Doesn't really matter all that much. Norman Osborn defeats him, kind of calls it a day. But then after that, it's back to business. And as he goes through and kind of continues talking to this unnamed person, that what you end up having is him basically taking back his Green Goblin uniform. Now, as we know, the Goblin formula in the bloodstream of Norman Osborn had been removed, and it has been for quite some time. That was done by Peter Parker. So Norman Osborn being able to actually transform into the Green Goblin is gone. But if you guys remember the previous story that we did, the whole thing was that Norman Osborn had basically bonded himself to the Carnage symbiote, and then had used that as kind of a backdoor method method of regaining the ability to turn into some variation of the Green Goblin. But as he's doing this person talking to him basically says like he'll never be able to defeat Spider-Man, right? Like he says like, I do know who Spider-Man is. You're never going to beat him, right? You're never going to be able to defeat this guy. The Green Goblin's a loser. You always have, you always will be. You've done everything you could to defeat this guy. You even threw his girl off a bridge. And that's when it clicks. That's when Norman Osborn's like, wait a minute, I threw his girl off. Oh my God, Spider-Man is Peter Parker. And that's like when he finally figures it out. And then you end up finding out this unnamed person he's talking to is J. Jonah Jameson. That J. Jonah Jameson inadvertently spilled the beans that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. And so following that, you pick back up at the Daily Bugle. Now, Peter Parker had been rehired at the Daily Bugle, right? Kind of a way for Dan Slott to sort of bring things back to the way they were when he initially started his run, and even before he started his run, right? It's just one of those things where the more things change, the more they stay the same. And so while you have Peter Parker kind of doing his thing and talking to everybody and sort of heading like the science division of the Daily Bugle and all that kind of stuff, suddenly, blow, in comes the Green Goblin, right? Just smashes into this place and just starts ripping everything up, and then tells Peter Parker, knowing he's Spider-Man, get Spider-Man here in 60 seconds or less, or I'm gonna kill everybody, right? And so at that point, Peter Parker does the only thing he can do, which is, quote unquote, he goes and he gets Spider-Man, right? He goes and grabs Spider-Man and brings it back. Now, while all that's going on, J. Jonah Jameson, and it's kind of gonna be a little bit of a background plot here, is basically struggling with the idea that he is the one that spilled the beans on Spider-Man's true identity, right? So basically, everything that happens from this point going forward, J. Jonah Jameson takes as basically being his fault. And that was really more Dan Slott's kind of testament to the character evolution of J. Jonah Jameson, which had been going on for quite some time, even before Dan Slott took over as writer. But the idea of J. Jonah Jameson moving away from just being this guy who ran the Daily Bugle, was basically always a dick to Peter Parker, ultimately ended up firing him, things like that, who was always just kind of a huge jerk. A lot of that changed. And one of the things that you saw was that he became a little more tender to Peter Parker and even to Spider-Man, a little more lenient, less just kind of like, this guy's a menace and he sucks and I hate him and we're just gonna publish really crappy things about him, right? That he actually gained a lot of respect for Spider-Man. A lot of that was predicated on the kind of things that Spider-Man done, even going so far as to save Jonah Jameson's life on multiple occasions. And so because of that, of course, this kind of fight breaks out between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin, but then you also end up having Flash Thompson as Agent Anti-Venom, who's a part of this as well. Now, his involvement here is largely due to the fact that the Hobgoblin had stolen technology that belonged to Alchemax. And so tracing down the Hobgoblin inevitably led him to where the Hobgoblin was defeated by Norman Osborn, which leads him to where J. Jonah Jameson is, which of course, he ends up freeing J. Jonah Jameson. And so that's when things kind of get a little bit crazy, is because what you end up having is switching over to Harry Osborn. One of his guys comes running in and says, look, like Norman Osborn's back in town, right? Your dad's back. As soon as that happens, their nanny basically snatches the kids up and then tranquilizes everybody and then leaves, right? But the initial fight between Spider-Man and Green Goblin is exactly what you would expect, right? There is a point where Green Goblin uses like some technology of Phil Urich to basically try to blow the whole place up. And ultimately, you know, Spider-Man basically ends up saving everybody from the explosion. I mean, there's a bunch of debris, right? And so people are injured, but nobody's killed, which is really the main goal here. And then Peter Parker confronts Green Goblin when he basically seems to be impaled on a giant piece of this building. The crazy thing is that Peter Parker does what Peter Parker always does, which is, man, I wish there was a way to save you, always kind of being the good guy, that sort of thing. And that's when Norman Osborn reveals that he's actually bonded to the Carnage symbiote. Now, this is cool. And I gotta say, like, at the time that this came out, even though we didn't really cover it, it was amazing. Like, the idea of like the Green Goblin becoming Carnage was nuts. And it was one of those things, it had never occurred to me before, right? Like the idea of the Green Goblin taking the Carnage symbiote and bonding it to himself. One, because the Green Goblin was largely believed to have just been a thing of the past, right? It made sense. Norman Osborn hadn't been relevant in years. There were other more compelling villains and even just general characters in the Spider-Man mythos that had been written by Dan Slott. So by all standards of measurement, if Norman Osborn as the Green Goblin never came back, you probably wouldn't miss him, because there was just so much going on in Dan Slott's run. You didn't really spare a second thought for the fact that Norman Osborn was gone. But having Osborn return, and then like he has the Carnage symbiote, he's literally firing off what would normally be pumpkin bombs, but they're like Carnage bombs that actually physically latch onto things as opposed to just landing in the general vicinity and exploding. It's awesome, right? It's one of the cool things. Now, the other part about this, and I love the way that Dan Slott played this, Peter Parker realizes right off the bat, he's no match for this, right? He's no match for the Red Goblin, right? And immediately just kind of like, I gotta go, right? Like it's kind of like, I gotta run, I gotta flee, I gotta do something, I gotta grab my bearings. That's why he basically stays stays in hiding, right? Because within the span of about 30 seconds, the Red Goblin overpowered Spider-Man to the point that like he's basically in shambles, right? Like his legs ripped to pieces where that bomb blew up on him and all that kind of stuff. And that's when he tells him, I don't ever want to see you operating as Spider-Man again, right? Like if I see a web, if I see anything that indicates that you are Spider-Man, I'm gonna kill everybody you know because I know who you are. And there's nowhere you can take them. There's nowhere you can put them where I won't be able to find them. And that makes sense. Remember, the resources of Norman Osborn as he's been bidding his return have expanded greatly. That's one of the reasons why Dan Slott gave us those stories where Norman Osborn had contacts in like Asia and South Africa and was part of like these great big huge, underground movements that were looking to consolidate power in different ways. He was kind of an information broker. By operating on a global scale, it allowed Norman Osborn to gain global contacts. And Peter Parker realizes this. He realizes that when Norman Osborn says, I will find you no matter where you go in the world, it's not a bluff, that he actually will be able to using his contacts, and he'll kill everybody that Peter Parker cares about. And so that's when Peter Parker kind of says, okay, fine, deal, right? And he makes a deal and just leaves the role of being Spider-Man seemingly forever, of course, as we know, until ultimately Norman Osborn is defeated. And so in his stead, what he does here is really genius. And I love the way that Norman Osborn played this. What you end up getting is basically a kind of coming together of the superhero community who are basically keeping an eye on the various members of Spider-Man's family, but it's largely just people Spider-Man knows and is intimately familiar with. I don't mean just like, like they're kissing and stuff like that. I mean like intimately familiar with in the sense that like they're exceedingly close, right? So like Miles Morales, you have Silk, right? Silk, of course, being one of the characters that was created as part of like the End of the Spider-Verse storyline, somebody that has kind of, well, she has an intimate relationship with Peter Parker. They were banging like rabbits when she first showed up, right? You guys remember that? They couldn't stop banging, man. Like it was crazy. It was hilarious. Flash Thompson, Agent Anti-Venom, is here. Of course, he ended up rescuing J. Jonah Jameson, but it's also kind of a few cool things that you see going on because ultimately J. Jonah Jameson actually contacts Peter Parker, and Peter Parker just kind of like, he knows my identity, right? And the response to Jameson is, yes, I know. I inadvertently told him. He had me tied up, and I basically said that he threw your girlfriend, Gwen Stacy, off the bridge. And that's when he realized what was going on. At that moment, Peter Parker hangs up. Now, one thing to know, it's not as though Peter Parker absolutely despises J. Jonah Jameson because of this. He does recognize the nature of nuance, right? That sometimes people just end up letting things slip. The difference here, though, is that he expected better of J. Jonah Jameson, right? He expected that if his identity was going to be leaked, it wouldn't come from somebody like J. Jonah Jameson being sloppy, spouting off at the mouth, and revealing the wrong kind of information. And so following that, you actually end up picking up with the nanny of Liz Allen and Harry Osborn's kids, of course, snatching them up, and is basically on the run. Ultimately, she's caught up to by Liz Allen, of course, when you're the head of Alchemax, right? One of the single biggest corporations in the world, you're going to be found. Like, you're going to be able to find people, right? That's just the way that it is. And then, of course, the Red Goblin shows up and attacks them all. And that's when you end up finding out here that the nanny of Harry Osborn and Liz Allen's kids is actually Norman Osborn's, at least believed to have been long dead wife, right? Harry Osborn's mom. It's a crazy thing. She was believed to have been dead for a long time. In fact, that was the major focal point behind the relationship between Harry and Norman in the early days of Marvel Comics, or at least the early days of Norman Osborn's appearances, right? That he constantly pushed his son, that he, in a lot of ways, he kind of abandoned being a true father figure in terms of being like emotionally supportive of his son, and instead just gave him things. And so it's one of those things where not really having a nurturing hand in his life, in a lot of ways, is what led Harry Osborn to, one, resent his father, and two, to fall down the path of actually becoming the Green Goblin himself after Norman Osborn was seemingly killed. The idea was that because Norman Osborn was just so dark and so sadistic, because he was so twisted, that she actually faked her death and it kind of snuck her way back ever since. And it sort of makes sense, right? This was one of those things that was met with kind of a mixed reaction by comic fans, but she couldn't just show up, right, and just be like, Harry, I'm your mom. Can I watch your kids? I don't want to be a mom again. You would expect the kind of visceral reaction that most any of us would have, which is, where have you been all this time? Why would I trust you, right? I mean, having her kind of sneak her way back in, and then having the revelation sort of coming out in this same capacity is pretty shocking. The most disappointing thing about this is that this comes at the very end of Dan Slott's run. You're not going to see much coming out of this. It's one of these things that Dan Slott developed, presumably with the intention of possibly building on it later in the sense of somebody else using that, but ultimately it didn't become like a major focal point. It kind of did, but not really. And so one of the things that happens here is you actually end up having all these different members of kind of Spider-Man's inner circle who all basically arrive here with the intention of facing off against the Red Goblin and defeating him, and all of them are defeated, right? Every single one of them, including Flash Thompson, Agent Anti-Venom, right? The Red Goblin overpowers them all, and he almost goes in to kill Flash Thompson, but then ultimately lets him leave. And so following that, he ends up actually snatching up Normie Osborn, right? Basically his grandson, and then basically turning him into what is in effect a Carnage Goblin, right? Kind of turning him into a facsimile of himself, and the two of them sort of go forward from there. Now, the motivation behind that is thin at best, right? That's one of the things that was really disappointing about this, is that what you end up learning here is the goal of Norman Osborn as the Carnage symbiote is to basically retake his empire. And I understand where Dan Slott was coming from, because the whole motivation of Norman Osborn in the early days of his appearances was to basically acquire a huge amount of wealth and influence, right? To basically live at kind of the top of the criminal underworld, and even in this instance, at kind of the top of the corporate world, and then just kind of control everything from there. The reality of this, though, is we're long since past such simple plot points when it comes to villains and heroes and things like that. It's interesting to see, but people in this day and age, when they read comics, kind of want a little bit more, right? The idea of like a villain doing what they do because they just want to acquire wealth or power, that's something that you normally see with like a B-list villain. That's not really something that you expect from Norman Osborn, even if that was the basis behind his character in the early days. The biggest issue that you have here is what would be the role of Norman Osborn in this era. And so that's one of the reasons why Dan Slott largely seems to have gone with that whole decision. Now, of course, Peter Parker ends up kind of staying behind and basically helping like Miles Morales and Cindy Moon and Flash Thompson and all these guys, right? Johnny Storm of the Fantastic Four, of course, one of his personal friends, helping them all out. And that's when you also get a little revelation here, in the sense that like traditional powers, as they're normally used against symbiotes, right? Fire and sound, they don't work, not in the same capacity that they normally do, right? If this was Cletus Cassidy as Carnage, any one of those things would work, right? You'd be able to blast him with sonics, you'd be able to set him on fire, and you could overpower the symbiote and then actually try to push it back into Cletus Cassidy, right? Because the Carnage symbiote can't really be removed from Cletus since it's bond to his bloodstream. But here with the Red Goblin, it doesn't work that way. He's basically immune to most any weakness that symbiotes normally have. Now, one of the things you actually get here, and is kind of a genius moment from J. Jonah Jameson, is he sits down in his apartment, he's like, okay, so like obviously Norman Osborn's running around as a Green Goblin with a Carnage symbiote. Okay, what symbiote out there could defeat Carnage? And that's when it dawns on him, okay, so it's definitely got to be Venom. But like, how do I find Eddie Brock? Like, I mean, Eddie Brock isn't a guy that you call up, right? I mean, it doesn't really work that way, but then it turns out he is. And the reason why and one of the funniest things ever, the reason why is because Eddie Brock is basically running the same scam that Spider-Man ran, where Peter Parker would take pictures of himself as Spider-Man and then sell them to the Daily Bugle. Basically, Eddie Brock's doing the same thing with Venom. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. Like, it's not the worst idea, right? Not the worst idea at all. I mean, it worked for Peter Parker, stands to reason it would work for Eddie Brock, and it does, right? It actually does. In fact, he works at a newspaper called The Fact Sheet. It's kind of nowhere near as big as the Daily Bugle, but he's still basically doing the same thing. Not only that, Eddie Brock is calling himself Mr. Sim, right? So obviously Eddie Brock is one of the least imaginative people you could ever imagine. And honestly, it's always kind of been that way. Even now, I mean, I love Eddie Brock. Don't get me wrong. I love Eddie Brock. Absolutely love Eddie Brock, but he's never really had any imagination. And so what ends up happening here is that J. Jonah Jameson actually gets a hold of Eddie Brock and says, hey man, like the Carnage symbiote has bonded itself to the Green Goblin, or at least Norman Osborn welcomed the transition, and now like things are popping off. We need you to help. And what ends up actually happening here is you switch over to Stark Tower, where Mary Jane Watson's kind of doing her thing, and you actually end up having the Venom symbiote kind of going after her. Not really intentionally, it's more to gain information. And so what you end up getting here is basically this kind of fight between the Red Goblin and Venom. And this is cool, man. Like, it's one of the cool things, right? This story was really kind of the swan song of Dan Slott, right? Like, hey guys, have you ever wanted to see what would happen if like the Carnage symbiote bonded itself to the Green Goblin and then fought like Venom and Miles Morales and Spider-Man and like everybody else in the Spider-Man mythos? Well, you can see it right now, right? That was basically his whole thing. And it was cool, right? It was awesome. Of course, as you would expect, Norman Osborn overpowers Venom, and it actually leads to Spider-Man and Venom teaming up to face off against the Red Goblin. But again, while they are able to hold their own to a degree, at the end of the day, the power of the Red Goblin is just too much. He's far more powerful than either Green Goblin or Carnage by themselves, and is able to overpower both. Now, the funny thing about this is this has huge callbacks to Maximum Carnage, right? It's got massive callbacks to Maximum Carnage. I know a lot of you guys are pretty OG. We covered Maximum Carnage, but like, do you guys remember what it was like reading that story when it came out? It was amazing. Watching Carnage just like wreck Venom and Spider-Man at the same time, it was pretty cool. But on top of that, what you end up realizing here is that ultimately Eddie Brock and Spider-Man teaming up, it just kind of won't work. It's actually Eddie Brock who realizes that, right? Where he's like, you and I teaming up together, it's just not gonna work, right? I mean, this guy is not Carnage. He's not Cletus Cassidy. He's not the guy that we're familiar with. We need to basically be greater than the sum of their parts. And so what he actually ends up doing is giving his Venom symbiote back to Peter Parker, and Peter Parker goes back to being Venom again. Which I absolutely loved, right? J. Jonah Jameson digs out one of his old spider slayers, right? And then basically uses like the ability to remote control it to try to send it out and take out the Red Goblin, which of course doesn't work, right? I mean, like he literally just gets crushed. I mean, it's not even close. I mean, nobody ever expected that to succeed. It's kind of the funny thing. J. Jonah Jameson's trying his best, right? I mean, you can't help but feel bad for the guy, right? I mean, he's doing his best. He's doing what he can. He can't do much, but the fact that he's even trying, I think, speaks volumes to the evolution of J. Jonah Jameson. But Peter Parker in possession of the Venom symbiote and then facing off against Red Goblin is really, really cool here, because it kind of turns into a bit of a cat and mouse game, right? Peter Parker's standard powers are basically augmented given the Venom symbiote, right? Increased strength, increased speed, increased agility. So it makes him much, much closer to the Red Goblin. And in fact, it seems as though he gains the upper hand. And so one of the things that Red Goblin does here is he says, when I attacked everybody that you knew, right? Like your Aunt May, when I attacked Cindy Moon, when I attacked all these different people, what I did is I basically planted in them these little barbs, and these little barbs will basically give me control over them, right? So this is kind of the early stages, or really sort of the early indications of where it is that Donny Cates at least began to develop the idea of Carnage basically taking over people in their entirety. This had happened before. That's something that I do want to point out here. It's not the first time we ever saw Carnage basically taking over people, but it is cool to see it happen in this way when it's the personal family members of Peter Parker. And so Peter Parker actually ends up deviating off course, basically stops following Red Goblin, of course, with the intention of basically trying to save his various family members. And that's when you end up having Flash Thompson, who basically reveals, as Agent Anti-Venom, that's what I was doing when I was running around to each of these individual people. I was removing the barbs from them, right? Like, I'm Agent Anti-Venom, like I literally cure symbiotes. That's kind of my thing, right? Like I cure impurities, that sort of thing. And so ultimately the two of them actually team up to face off against Red Goblin. And the reason why here is because if Spider-Man wants to stand the best possible chance of defeating the Red Goblin, he's gonna need like Flash Thompson to pull this off, right? He's gonna need this guy to do it. He's gonna absolutely need Flash Thompson and Agent Anti-Venom. And that's kind of the funny thing, right? Peter Parker teaming up with his high school bully to defeat Norman Osborn. Kind of crazy. The funny thing about this though, and what makes this wild, is that because of the fact that Norman Osborn has this Green Goblin tech in addition to his symbiote, and because of the fact that as the Red Goblin, he's immune to the normal weaknesses of a symbiote, that means things like electricity, fire, all that kind of stuff, he can use, right? And so actually what he ends up doing is attacking Flash Thompson and basically just shocking the absolute life out of this guy, and basically electrocutes him to the point where he basically kills Flash Thompson. Now, when that happens, the death of Flash Thompson here, this was nuts, right? This is one of the things that made this story so crazy, is because it's like, oh my God, the Red Goblin just killed Flash Thompson, right? He just killed Agent Anti-Venom. This is where Agent Anti-Venom died. And it's one of the things that we talked about during the events of King in Black, where Flash Thompson came back, right? Where he ended up returning during that event. That's one of the things that made it so cool, because remember guys, people loved Flash Thompson as Agent Venom and Agent Anti-Venom. People thought it was just one of the coolest developments for his character ever. And even to this day, people talk about how great that was. And so having this whole thing go down here, Peter Parker lashes out. And when he does, his symbiote begins to gain the better of him. Of course, he's able to kind of retake himself, kind of regain his bearings. He stops becoming that kind of twisted, sadistic version of Venom and just sort of goes back to being Peter Parker in control of his own symbiote suit. But at this point, now it's become a much more personal vendetta, because what this really establishes here is that when you have Red Goblin show up and some guys dressed up as Spider-Man is like, man, why are you on my spot, right? Like, you got to go work in some other spot, that he kills this guy, right? And that's when Peter Parker kind of realizes this guy has no remorse whatsoever. Now, the crazy thing is Peter already kind of knew this, right? I mean, it's the Carnage symbiote, which already loves inflicting as much harm as it possibly can, combined with the sociopathic nature of Norman Osborn. I mean, it was a recipe for just as much destruction as you could could possibly imagine. And so because of the fact that Peter Parker doesn't, seems to be on this idea that if they keep fighting in their normal forms, more people will die, what he actually ends up doing is manipulating Norman Osborn and saying, look, we can keep on fighting like this, and sure, you'll overpower me and you'll kill me, but here's the problem, man. Everybody's gonna say it's because of Carnage. You never beat me because it was actually you. Nobody will ever say Green Goblin defeated Spider-Man. Nobody will ever say Green Goblin killed Spider-Man. What they'll say is Carnage defeated Spider-Man. Is that really what you want? Do you really want your Carnage symbiote to be the one that gets all the credit for this crazy deed that you managed to pull off? That Cletus Cassidy is the one who killed Spider-Man? And that's what kind of drives Norman Osborn to basically seize control of himself and actually cast the symbiote off. More so than that, Spider-Man does the exact same thing. Now this was cool, right? And we kind of knew it was going in this direction. It's the classic fight, Spider-Man versus the Green Goblin. Now this is kind of a follow-up to the fight that we saw before, but the fight that we saw before was Spider-Man versus just Norman Osborn. Having Spider-Man fight the Green Goblin here, there is so much history and so much rage and anger that goes into this fight, right? Because remember guys, Green Goblin is kind of the amalgamation of everything that represents Spider-Man losing things that are important to him, right? In this fight, he talks about how Uncle Ben had died, and the death of Uncle Ben basically taught him about what it meant to be courageous. It meant that if you have the power to do something, you have the responsibility to do that thing. He talks about the nature of sacrifice, and he talks about life, right? The idea that Norman Osborn had taken Gwen Stacy away from Spider-Man, right? And that's one of the most important things. We've mentioned that before, right? The death of Uncle Ben taught Spider-Man that if he can act, he has the responsibility to act. But the death of Gwen Stacy, I would say, was more important than the death of Uncle Ben, because it taught Spider-Man he can't be reckless, that he has to be careful with the power that he has. It's one thing to be a superhero and to just be a heroic person who does heroic things, but you have to understand nuance. You have to understand what it means to be a hero in relation to those who are weaker than you and how to handle those kinds of things. Not only that, he reflects on friends, he reflects on family, he reflects on the fact that this fight he has with the Green Goblin and overpowering and defeating Green Goblin is not just Peter Parker fighting for himself. It's Peter Parker fighting for everyone he cares about, for everybody who's important to him, both people who are dead and people who are alive, that he's surrounded by people who in one form or another have improved and shaped his life in a way that have made him better. And so as a result of that, when he overpowers the Green Goblin, the Green Goblin calls out for the Carnage symbiote. And that's when it dawns on Peter Parker, the Carnage symbiote is just, it's just a symbiote now. It's just by itself. It's not bonded to the Goblin formula, so it has all the weaknesses that the symbiote normally has. He's like, okay, I need fire. Where can I find fire? And then he looks around, he's like, I can find fire everywhere. Everything's on fire. So he just starts grabbing things and just smashing them into the symbiote and basically trying to destroy the Carnage symbiote, which he seemingly successfully does. Not only that, one of the crazy things that happens here is that as that's going on with Spider-Man, you have J. Jonah Jameson who comes out of nowhere with a handgun with the intention of shooting Norman Osborn. Now, this is a massive moment. And the reason why is because as we've done so many times before on this channel, this breaks down into a philosophical discussion. Is Spider-Man really doing anybody any good by keeping Norman Osborn alive and handing him over to the police, right? One of the things he says as he approaches Norman Osborn is he says, Osborn, you're not fooling me with that act. You're not fooling anybody. This has to stop. And when Spider-Man approaches him and says like, what are you doing? You got to put the gun down. The response to Jameson is, I'm not stupid, Parker. I know how this works. He'll be back and he knows. He'll take someone else, Betty, Robbie, your aunt, my son, me. No, this is my fault. I have to end it, right? Kind of the culmination of this feeling that he's been experiencing, that he's the reason why Norman Osborn was able to achieve all this in the first place by figuring out the identity of Spider-Man. Now, one of the things here, and this is something to notice, J. Jonah Jameson doesn't really hesitate here. It's not one of these things where he shows kind of a moment of uncertainty, right? He's just like, this is my fault. I have to end it. Bow, right, goes to pull the trigger. Now Spider-Man jumps in front of it and actually saves the life of Norman Osborn. This in turn is a reflection of what Peter Parker truly stands for. And even J. Jonah Jameson asked him that. He's like, why would you do that? In response to Peter is, because I could. And that meant that I had to. Because with great power, there must also come great responsibility to everyone, even the worst of us. And that's kind of the crazy thing, is because in reality, Norman Osborn kind of needed to die. Now, what ends up happening here with Norman Osborn's life being saved, you get this crazy scenario, right? The guy's basically locked up in Ravencroft Asylum, right? Just sort of locked away. But one of the things that happens here is Peter Parker as Spider-Man goes to visit Norman Osborn. And this is really more of just kind of checking up and seeing, has he spilled the beans on who I am? Has he told anybody who I am? The real question you have to ask here is, he's in an asylum. Even if he did, would anybody actually believe him? But he asked him, he was like, okay, like, like, how are we gonna play this, right? You know my identity, you know what's going on, how are we gonna play this? And ultimately, he's just kind of like, I know who you are, right? You're the world's biggest screw up, that kind of a thing. He's like, you're Norman Osborn. And Peter's like, what? Okay, so who are you again? And that's when Norman Osborn responds, I'm Cletus Cassidy. And so in essence, the personality, really the kind of the mental imprint of Cletus Cassidy seems to have just basically bonded itself to Norman Osborn. In effect, by Norman Osborn having the Goblin formula and then also combining that with the Carnage symbiote, it basically made him insane. He's completely and totally lost his mind. Right now, this was basically the idea of Dan Slott kind of writing it out, right? And saying, okay, so like this is where the Green Goblin stands now. Right, Green Goblin is absolutely insane. It's sort of closing off this loop, but also leaving a bit of a way out in case somebody wants to bring Norman Osborn back. It's pretty easy to cure somebody of insanity in Marvel Comics, so it can kind of go either way. Either he stays in Ravencroft Asylum, and as far as we're aware, in terms of Marvel publishing, we don't see him for 20 years, or it could be that Nick Spencer brings him back in like 10 issues, and he's cured of his insanity, and he just kind of goes about and does his normal thing, returns as quote-unquote the Green Goblin. The other thing about this is that there is an effort to basically remove the Carnage symbiote from Normie, and to a degree it seems to work, that the symbiote is basically siphoned off of him and basically destroyed in the process. Of course, you end up learning there are remnants of the symbiote still there, right? So that's kind of a thing where it's a potential plot thread that could be used at a future point in time. And then of course you pick up with this idea of really this kind of funeral for Flash Thompson where everybody sort of says their goodbyes. And it's one of the things that Peter kind of muses on. He actually gives this really amazing speech, right? Given the history, the fact that Flash Thompson ridiculed and bullied Peter Parker so often when they were in high school, he says, hey Flash man, always so cool. This guy, he knew a waltz from a cha-cha. Who am I kidding? You were a bully. You were my bully. When I think of all the lockers that you shoved me into, but here's this thing, right? Bullies don't come out of nowhere. Someone always hurt them first. Didn't find that out about you until years later. And then he says, then one day everything changed. You told me that you found a hero to look up to, and you started a life of service, helped your fellow man, saved so many lives, protecting others in ways people will never know. You became a man that we're all so proud of. And me, I found myself to be a bit of a bully now and then, making fun of others, rattling their cages, telling myself they deserved it. And he says, I want you to know that I want to change. Because of you, Flash Thompson, I hope you can be proud of me. I know you're my friend, but there's something I never told you. I'm your #1 fan. You're the hero that I look up to. And that's a huge statement coming from Peter Parker, given the kind of history they have together. But following that, right, you mean, you basically have business as usual, right? Things pop off, Peter Parker races off, he's like, I gotta go be Spider-Man, and you have J. Jonah Jameson, he's like, Parker, and that kind of a thing, and then it's back to Spider-Man being Spider-Man. But with that being said, guys, this is the end. We're completely done with Dan Slott's Spider-Man run. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. We are going to make a full story video out of all of this because it's just been one crazy and fun adventure, but we finally finished it. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.